My name is Alexander Whitmore, though most people in my small town hardly know more than the fact that I am a widower who lives quietly on the edge of the old district. That's exactly how I intended it. For years, I let people believe I was nothing more than a man who scraped by on a modest pension, keeping to myself after my wife passed. It was easier that way. Privacy, after all, is a kind of armor. But nothing can prepare you for the sting of humiliation when it comes from within your own family. At my son Theodore's wedding, his bride, Isabella Harrington, turned her sharp smile on me in front of her glittering guests and said with cruel clarity, "Look at this filthy old man, what an embarrassment." Her words cut through the music and laughter, and the hall erupted in mocking chuckles. My hands tightened around the stem of my glass, but I said nothing. And then, silence fell. Her father, Lord Gregory Harrington, went pale as he studied my face. In a trembling whisper only those nearest could hear, he said, "Wait, aren't you the very man, the millionaire who saved my company?" In that instant, everything changed. I felt the orchestra strings before I heard thema vibration in the parquet that traveled up the soles of my shoes and settled behind my ribs. Crystal chandeliers sifted light across the Harrington ballroom, turning champagne into liquid gold and conversation into a soft, expensive hum. Men in midnight tuxedos formed neat constellations near the bar, women in silk gowns moved like a tide of color from one glittering island to the next. The Harrington crest, two rampant stags beneath a coronet, was stitched into the banners, embossed on the napkins, and discreetly etched into the glass doors as if the family needed the room itself to remember whom it served. I stood near a marble column with a view of the dance floor and pretended to study the floral arrangements. White peonies, English roses, sprays of orchids, blooms that never wilted because a discreet team replaced them every hour. It was the kind of detail that impressed the sort of people who like their money visible. I've learned that, in certain rooms, flowers function like trophies. "Theodore looks perfect tonight," a guest murmured as my son stepped into the light with his new wife. He did look perfect, broad-shouldered, steady, handsome in a way that's more dependable than striking. I felt the quiet pride of every father who ever taught a boy to tie a tie and to keep his word. Theo caught my eye briefly and lifted his glass. I nodded back, careful not to intrude on his moment. Isabella Harrington, now Whitmore, sparkled under the chandeliers in a gown that seemed engineered to catch light the way a harbor catches ships, effortlessly and without intention. She was lovely in the way catalog models are, symmetrical, practiced, and secure in her loveliness. Her smile was a brand. Her family orbited that brand like shareholders. I would have been content to remain a shadow at the edge of their stage, to leave the night to youth and golden futures, were it not for the knife she drew with a sentence. She drifted toward our corner surrounded by bridesmaids and an entourage of laughter. Her gaze skimmed me as if appraising a scuff on polished wood. "Oh," she said brightly, her voice pitched to travel. "Everyone, meet the groom's father." The cluster turned as one. Then the blade, "Look at this filthy old man, what an embarrassment." It hung there, perfectly shaped and perfectly cruel, a cocktail cherry in a glass of ice. People do odd things when a remark lands like that. Some titter. Some freeze. Some pretend they misheard, which is a form of prayer. I simply breathed, counted to 3, and sipped water so my hand had an errand that wasn't striking the table. There are a dozen possible replies to an insult. Silence is the only one that ages well. Her mother, Lady Catherine Pearl's, posture, and a perfume that reminded me of lilies in a chapel gave a small, pleased smirk that never reached her eyes. The bridesmaids flicked glances at one another, weighing how much courage it would take to laugh. Not much, as it turned out. A ripple of amusement spread, a man near the bar barked a short, startled sound, then covered it with his glass. Injustice, when it is personal, is a private earthquake that looks like stillness to everyone else. I set the water down. "Congratulations," I said to Isabella, and I meant it because I love my son. "You look radiant." Something in the politeness irritated her. Perhaps she expected outrage, or apology, or a flustered exit to reward the performance. She curled her lip in that way the very young sometimes do when they mistake cruelty for style. And then the temperature in the room changed. I don't mean the air, someone dimmed the chandeliers by a breath, the music softened, but the mood fell a degree as if the house sensed a draft. Lord Gregory Harrington, whose laughter had rung through the cocktail hour like silver coin on marble, had gone quiet. He stared at me with fixed attention, the sort reserved for old maps and ticking clocks. "Father?" Isabella prompted, amusement returning to uncertain. "We're introducing people." He didn't answer at first. He stepped closer, peering with the impatience of a man trying to bring a memory into focus. Perhaps it was the angle of the light. Perhaps the way I hold my shoulders. Perhaps you can't disguise habit, perhaps modest suits fit rich men the way a uniform fits a soldier. "Excuse me," he said, voice low and unsteady, "but your name?" The question felt like the creak of a door in an empty wing. "Alexander Whitmore," I replied. The glass in his hand tapped the rim of the tray as he set it down, not quite a clink, not quite a tremor. "Whitmore," he repeated, tasting it, and then the look recognition followed by accounting, like a ledger balancing itself in the mind. "Wait, aren't you?" He stopped, glanced at his daughter, then back to me, and lowered his voice until it brushed only the nearest ears. "Aren't you the man who—" Another pause. He swallowed. "The millionaire who saved my company?" You could feel the sound leave the room. Music went on playing, but ears shift allegiance in an instant, they belonged to us now. The laughter behind Isabella thinned to a wire. Lady Catherine's smirk snapped off as if someone had snuffed a candle. Those with practiced faces practiced them harder. I put my palms together, not prayer, not applause. "I was part of the group that helped," I said. "Accuracy is a form of discretion." Gregory's eyes glazed with quick, humiliating mathematics, acquisition dates, emergency lines of credit, the night meetings, the relief he told no one about. When pride survives bankruptcy by one signature, it never forgets the pen. "Good heavens," he whispered. "It's you." Oliviano. Isabella stared at her father as though he had just spoken a dialect she didn't know he knew. "What are you talking about?" Gregory forced something like composure onto his face. "Later," he said softly. "We'll speak later." But later, as I've learned, tends to arrive sooner than expected. He extended his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, louder now, smoothing dignity back into his tone, "I owe you my gratitude." Heads turned because gratitude from a Harrington is uncommon currency. He looked like a swimmer who has rediscovered his footing and is determined no one saw him flail. A nearby guest, a man whose cufflinks could have bought my first car, glanced between us with new interest. People recalibrate quickly when money shifts tables. The space around me loosened. The marble column felt less like a pillar to lean on and more like a line I had stepped beyond without moving. Isabella colored. It was the particular flush of someone who realizes her cruelty will be expensive. "I didn't know," she said, brittle brightness returned, "that you consult." "I prefer to keep my affairs quiet," I said. Lady Catherine intervened with social triage. "Well," she declared, turning to a circle of listeners, "this is all very unexpected. Perhaps we should return to the receiving line." She heard it with a smile, but curiosity is a stubborn breed. The story had escaped its leash and was trotting happily down the hall. Theo arrived then, his face a question that dared not be asked in public. He squeezed my shoulder with a pressure that said, "Are you all right?" I gave him a small nod that said, "I am, and you will be." Fatherhood, at a certain age, is mostly messages you send without words. The orchestra found a waltz, staff glided with fresh trays, the banners didn't so much as sigh. But the ballroom center of gravity had shifted a few inches in my direction. I didn't want it. I'd spent years learning how not to be a center of anything. Yet sometimes you are found, whether or not you intended to hide. "Mr. Whitmore," Gregory said more firmly now, as if he'd made a choice, "might I steal a moment? There's a matter of thanks." A euphemism, but a useful one. Isabella's mouth tightened, Lady Catherine's eyes flicked from face to face like a fencer looking for open guard. Of course, I said. We walked toward a side gallery hung with ancestral portraits, Harringtons painted to look timeless, estates rendered as if weather never visited. The corridor was cool, dim, quiet enough to hear leather soles on stone. I owe you an apology, Gregory began, the words catching on the difficult consonants of pride. For my daughter's comment. And for not recognizing sooner the measure of the man my family has, he searched for the word that didn't concede too much. Misjudged. Apology accepted is a gift you give yourself. There's no need, I replied. Let the children have their glitter. We'll have the substance. He exhaled, relief wrapped in respect. If you have a moment after the first dance, he said, I'd appreciate a private word. There are things I should clarify. I'll make the time. We re-entered the ballroom as the MC called the couple to the floor. Applause rose like a scripted sunrise, warm and inevitable. As Theo took Isabella's hand and they moved beneath the chandeliers, I felt two truths settle beside each other in my chest. I loved my son more than I hated the insult, and the night had just become a negotiation. I stepped back to my marble column, lifted my water, and watched them turn. Privacy is an armor, yes. But sometimes you are required to fight in it. I have been called many things in my life: engineer, widower, father, but never millionaire. At least, not aloud, not in public. The people who truly know me can be counted on one hand, and even they believe the story I crafted years ago, that I live on a modest pension, perhaps bolstered by a little inheritance, and nothing more. In truth, my fortune began long before Theodore met Isabella, before Harrington banners and champagne galas. It began with work steady, relentless, and quiet. When I was a younger man, I spent long hours in a laboratory that smelled of solder and machine oil, chasing an idea most colleagues dismissed as folly. My wife, Eleanor, used to joke that she became a widow decades before her time, because my true mistress was the circuitry on my desk. She said it fondly, with that patience only she possessed. Eleanor believed in me even when I doubted myself, and when the design finally came together, a new way to regulate power consumption in small devices, she was the one who insisted we patent it. That single decision altered the course of our lives. Within 2 years, technology firms were bidding for rights. We sold at a figure that left me breathless, $30 million. Not enough to buy kingdoms, but enough to unlock doors. Eleanor wanted a simpler home, not a palace. She wanted scholarships for underprivileged students in her name, not headlines. So we agreed on a path of discretion. We would live as if nothing had changed. Theodore was still in college then, earnest and ambitious. We told him only that a comfortable nest egg had come through, that his future would be secure should hardship ever arrive. We did not mention millions, only stability. I wanted him to build his career with his own hands, unclouded by the haze of inherited wealth. A man who believes he is ordinary will strive harder than one who assumes the world is already his. Our second chapter came when Eleanor and I began investing. Some people gamble at casinos, others gamble on the stock exchange. We chose the latter, but not blindly. I read annual reports the way priests read scripture, line by line, hunting for truth behind the numbers. Eleanor had a knack for sensing which young companies possessed genuine soul rather than just hype. We lost, yes, no portfolio grows without scars, but we won more often than not. Over a decade, the $30 million swelled into several hundred million. Eleanor passed away before she could see the final bloom of those investments. I buried her on a hill she loved, under a sycamore that whispered when the wind was right. To the world, I became the solitary widower with a quiet home and a son making his way in business. Inside, I became a steward of a fortune I could never flaunt, because her voice still guided me, live quietly. Let your work, not your wealth, define you. That principle served me well when I encountered Harrington Industries. Charles Harrington, Isabella's father, was drowning in debt 3 years ago. He had stretched too far acquisitions, expansions, vanity projects that looked impressive on glossy brochures but bled money. His empire trembled. Banks circled like vultures. Employees whispered of layoffs. Through a network of advisors, I saw the opportunity. Beneath the mountain of debt, Harrington Industries still had solid foundations, good patents, skilled staff, loyal clients. It was worth saving. I did not approach with my own name. I formed a shell company, negotiated in shadows, and wrote checks that stabilized what could have been rubble. I never did it for gratitude, I did it because I believed the core deserved survival. Still, when the papers were signed and Charles's relief showed in his handshake, I thought, he has no idea who stands before him. And so my life continued, one part quiet father, another part hidden benefactor. Theo believed I scraped by with savings and the pension from my engineering years. He worked his way through graduate school, built his career, bought his first car with his own loans. I let him. It would have insulted both our prides to hand him keys he did not earn. Now, standing in the Harrington ballroom, watching the same man whose company I had saved turn pale with recognition, I realized my carefully spun web of secrecy was fraying. Isabella's insult stung less than the look in Theodore's eyes as whispers rippled. For years, I had carried the weight of wealth alone, convinced I was protecting him. But secrets, like debts, collect interest. Eventually, they demand payment. I sipped my water, eyes on the chandeliers, and thought of Eleanor. She would have urged me to stay calm, to let the night pass, to reveal nothing. But she is gone, and I am left with decisions no one else can make. The laughter had died, but the sting remained. Theodore deserved to know the truth, and yet I feared what that truth might cost. Wealth is a peculiar burden, it can buy silence, loyalty, and influence, but it cannot purchase back innocence once lost. And so I stood in the ballroom of the Harrington estate, carrying two lives in one body, the invisible man they mocked, and the quiet millionaire who held their future in his hands. The longer I watched Theodore dance with his bride, the more I knew, the time for invisibility was ending. The ballroom had returned to its rhythm, at least on the surface. The orchestra swelled into a Strauss waltz, the chandeliers flickered like stars arranged by design, and the guests tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened. Yet in every glance cast my way, I could sense the change. Whispers spread faster than champagne bubbles. Charles Harrington stood not 20 feet from me, his jaw tight, his expression caught between fear and awe. He had tried to mask it with laughter, with polite handshakes, but a man cannot unsee what his mind suddenly remembers. He had recognized me. He knew. The first time I saw him like this was 3 years ago, in a boardroom lit by fluorescent lamps rather than crystal chandeliers. Harrington Industries was collapsing then. Charles, desperate and defiant, paced like a caged animal while lawyers outlined the debt he had accumulated. I had been present at that meeting, though not as myself. My name was hidden behind the veil of a shell corporation, but my eyes were there, watching, weighing. Charles hardly noticed me. To him, I was just another silent investor in the background. He never realized I was the hand keeping his empire alive. Until now. When Isabella humiliated me with her cruel words, I thought the night couldn't sour further. But Charles's reaction proved me wrong. His silence, his sudden pallor, drew the curiosity of everyone near us. It was the kind of recognition that could not be undone. His gaze pinned me like a butterfly, and I knew the cocoon of privacy I had woven for years was beginning to unravel. Alexander Whitmore, he whispered earlier, and the tremor in his voice was impossible to miss. Now, he hovered near his wife, Lady Catherine, who shot him a questioning look. She saw his unease but had no explanation. Isabella, oblivious in her vanity, laughed with her bridesmaids as if her earlier insult had been the highlight of the evening. Only Theodore noticed something different, watched his father-in-law with wary eyes, confusion etching lines across his brow. I excused myself from the main crowd and drifted toward a quieter corner near the portraits of Harrington ancestors. Heavy oil paintings of stern men and elegant women gazed down, their faces carrying the arrogance of generations who believed their lineage could never falter. How ironic that their proud descendant had once been saved by the very man their daughter had just mocked. The memory of that boardroom sharpened in my mind. Charles had been sweating through his tailored suit, debt documents piled high before him. Banks were ready to tear him apart, competitors waiting like wolves. My advisors whispered that Harrington Industries was finished, a sinking ship not worth rescuing. But I saw something in its bones, its patents, its engineers, its infrastructure. I knew with proper management it could thrive again. I decided to act, not as Alexander Whitmore but through a discreet acquisition vehicle. When the deal closed, Charles was too relieved to question who had truly rescued him. Now, under the chandeliers of his daughter's wedding, the truth clawed its way to the surface. His eyes met mine again, and in that single moment of recognition, I saw his pride crack. He had lived these past 3 years basking in recovery, never realizing his fortunes had been tied to me all along. He made his way toward me, every step deliberate, as if rehearsed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said finally, his voice pitched low enough for few to hear, "we must speak." I gave him a slight nod. "Later," I replied. "For now, let's not spoil your daughter's celebration." But the tension between us had already spoiled it. Theodore joined us then, looking from Charles to me. "What's going on?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. He had always trusted me to be straightforward, and now he sensed something being withheld. "Nothing that can't wait," Charles said quickly, forcing a smile. He patted Theo's shoulder, but the gesture rang hollow. My son looked to me, searching for truth in my expression. I offered only calm. The time wasn't right. Lady Catherine noticed the exchange, her social instincts sharper than her husband's. She narrowed her eyes at me, suspicion blooming. Isabella, catching none of this, continued to dazzle her friends, unaware that her careless cruelty had torn a hole in her family's carefully managed world. The dance floor sparkled with youth and laughter, but I stood apart, aware that every note of music was a countdown. The Harringtons would not let this lie. Isabella's insult was a wound, but Charles's recognition was a fracture, and fractures spread. I finished my drink and set the glass down gently, as though marking the end of a chapter. The game I had avoided for 15 years had just begun. For the first time that evening, I felt the stirrings of anger, not for myself but for Theodore. He had no idea what kind of storm his bride's family was about to unleash. I had protected him from wealth, from entitlement, from the knowledge of my fortune. But soon, protection would no longer be possible. Charles Harrington knew who I was. And now, his daughter-me new daughter-in-law would not stop until she knew too. The mask was slipping. The first dance ended with applause that sounded too brittle, like glass about to crack. Theodore led Isabella to their table, her laughter loud enough to convince the room that nothing was wrong. But I knew the tremor beneath the surface. Charles Harrington had seen me. He had remembered. And men like him don't let a revelation sit quietly, they prod at it, they analyze it, they turn it into leverage. I thought I could retreat into anonymity, but the night refused to let me. "Mr. Whitmore." His voice carried just enough weight to sound casual, yet his eyes betrayed the urgency underneath. Charles approached with a champagne flute in hand, his smile stretched thin as parchment. "A word, if I may." "Of course," I replied, though my pulse betrayed my calm exterior. We stepped into a side corridor where the sound of the orchestra dulled into a muffled echo. Oil lamps lined the walls, casting shadows over Harrington ancestors glaring down from their gilded frames. Charles cleared his throat, lowering his voice. "I had no idea it was you. 3 years ago, in that boardroom you were the one behind the purchase. You saved my company." His words trembled, not with gratitude but with the terror of a man realizing his fate had been tied to someone else's mercy. "I was one of several investors," I said smoothly. "The firm was worth saving." He shook his head. "No. I remember the way you sat in silence. The way the lawyers deferred to you. It was you. Tell me, why hide it? Why live as if his eyes darted over my plain suit, my modest watch? As if you're no one. I met his gaze evenly. Because I prefer to live unseen. It protects me. It protects my son. Charles swallowed, his throat tightening. You realize what this means, don't you? Isabella, she doesn't know. Neither does Catherine. If they discover. Then they'll discover, I interrupted. I've hidden nothing illegal, Charles. Only private. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. Lady Catherine herself emerged, her gown sweeping like a tidal wave, her sharp eyes narrowing as she caught the two of us in hushed conversation. Gregory, she said, suspicion dripping from her tone, what are you doing whispering in hallways with Mr. Whitmore? Charles fumbled. Just thanking him. For what? Her gaze flicked between us. For raising such a fine son, I answered smoothly. Theodore has been an honor to know. Her eyes lingered on me, assessing, like a jeweler testing whether a diamond was real. She didn't believe my easy dismissal, but she let it drop for now. We returned to the ballroom, but the damage was done. Catherine whispered to Isabella, who frowned and looked back at me with narrowed suspicion. I felt their gaze prick at my back like thorns as I took my seat at a corner table. The music swelled again, masking the storm brewing under the chandeliers. Guests returned to their conversations, but I knew the Harrington women would not rest until they uncovered whatever had unsettled Charles so deeply. Theodore came to me not long after. He sat at my table, his hand still clutching the napkin from the head table, his face clouded. Father, he said softly, what's going on? You've been strange tonight. And Isabella keeps asking questions. I studied my son. The boy Eleanor and I had raised to value honesty, discipline, and dignity. He had grown into a man of strength, yet still carried the earnest eyes of the child who once asked me if hard work always pays off. How could I tell him that the fortune I concealed was both proof and contradiction of that lesson? There are some things you don't need to worry about tonight, I said gently. This is your wedding. Enjoy it. But he wasn't convinced. Father, did you know Isabella's family before tonight? I hesitated. We've crossed paths. His frown deepened, but before he could press further, Isabella herself arrived. She rested her manicured hand on Theo's shoulder, her green eyes sharp as glass. Darling, she purred, though the sweetness in her tone was as false as the diamonds dangling from her ears, your mother-in-law and I were just wondering what exactly does your father do? Theo stiffened. He's retired. She tilted her head, her smile brittle. Is he? Because father seems to think otherwise. Her words pierced deeper than her insult earlier in the evening. She wasn't asking, she was challenging. I rose from my chair. Forgive me, I said calmly, but I think the bride and groom should return to their guests. Her smile froze, but her eyes blazed with calculation. I recognized that look. It was the gaze of someone who had found a thread and intended to pull until the entire fabric unraveled. Later that night, when the music ended and the last of the guests filtered into limousines, I walked alone to my car. The Harrington mansion glowed behind me, its windows blazing like watchful eyes. I could almost feel Isabella and Catherine staring from some high window, already plotting. Inside the quiet of my sedan, I let out the breath I had been holding since Charles whispered the truth. The walls of secrecy I had spent 15 years constructing were crumbling. Isabella's insult had been a spark, Charles's recognition, a crack, and Catherine's suspicion, the first blow of a hammer. I knew what was coming. Investigations. Questions. Pressure. And perhaps even Theodore caught in the crossfire. As I started the engine, Eleanor's voice echoed in memory, live quietly. Protect him. But perhaps quiet was no longer enough. Perhaps it was time to defend what we had built not with silence, but with strength. And as the Harrington estate receded in my rearview mirror, I knew, the real battle had only just begun. The days following the wedding should have been filled with peace for Theodore and Isabella, a honeymoon cocoon where the rest of the world falls away. Instead, the silence between our families grew heavier by the hour. I felt it each time the phone rang, each time my son's name flashed across the screen with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I had expected curiosity, but what came next was far more deliberate. 2 weeks after the wedding, my financial advisor, Sebastian Caldwell, called me into his office. He rarely summoned me with such urgency. His firm operated from a tall glass tower downtown, the kind of place designed to intimidate with chrome elevators and marble floors. When I stepped into his office, the city stretched behind him like a battlefield, and he looked every bit the general preparing for war. "Alexander," he began, fingers steepled, "we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions, very specific questions." I lowered myself into the leather chair across from him. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't come from idle gossip," Sebastian said. "Ownership structures. Shell corporations. Quiet acquisitions. Someone is trying to peel back layers you've kept hidden for years." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were reports, inquiries sent to financial registries, even notes from a private investigations firm in Manhattan. I turned one of the papers and saw the name in bold letters, Harrington. I closed the folder carefully. "Isabella?" Sebastian nodded grimly. "Your daughter-in-law has engaged professionals. And she's not working alone. Her mother has signed several retainers. They're looking for leverage. And from what I can tell, they believe you hold the key to restoring their family's standing." I sat back, letting the weight of it settle. I had suspected Isabella would pry, but this was organized. Ruthless. "Can they uncover the full extent?" I asked. "Not easily," Sebastian admitted. "Your structures are solid. The shell companies are clean, the trusts airtight. But persistence and money can make cracks appear where none existed before. If they push far enough, they could expose your involvement in the Harrington rescue. From there, it won't be long before they trace your wider portfolio." A wave of anger surged in me, sharper than the insult at the wedding. I had lived invisible for 15 years, not because I feared the world but because I wanted my son to grow unshadowed by wealth. And now, because of a cruel remark and an ungrateful family, that shield was being stripped away. "What would you advise?" I asked. "Control the narrative," Sebastian said without hesitation. "Get ahead of them. If they discover you piece by piece, they'll shape the story to suit their ambitions. But if you reveal yourself on your terms, you control the story and the consequences." I stared at the skyline. Control. I had spent decades controlling my fortune, my image, my silence. To surrender even a fraction felt like cutting out a part of myself. And yet, perhaps silence had become more dangerous than speech. "Thank you," I said, rising. "Keep me informed." That evening, my suspicions were confirmed in a more personal way. Theodore came to visit, his usual ease replaced with restless energy. He paced my small sitting room, glancing at the modest furniture, the bookshelves, the plain curtains, details that suddenly seemed to trouble him. "Father," he began, "Isabella's been curious. She's asked about your finances. She says the way Grandfather Harrington reacted at the wedding was unusual. She thinks you're hiding something." "And what do you think?" I asked. He hesitated. "I don't know. You've always lived simply. But the way he looked at you, it was like he owed you his life. Did you know him before?" I considered lying, as I had so many times before. But his ISO like Eleanor's demanded truth. "Yes," I said finally. "I knew him." Theo stopped pacing. "How?" "I can't explain everything now," I replied, voice low. "But understand this, everything I've done, every secret I've kept, was to protect you. To make sure you earned your life with your own hands. He studied me, confusion battling with loyalty. Father, I've built my career honestly. I don't need protecting. What I need is the truth. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. We should talk. Tomorrow. Noon. The Fairmont Hotel. It was signed simply, I.H. Isabella Harrington. I showed the message to Theo. His expression hardened. She's not going to stop, is she? No, I said quietly. She isn't. That night, long after Theodore left, I sat alone in my study with Eleanor's portrait above the mantel. She had warned me once, wealth attracts as much danger as envy. I had believed discretion would be enough. But now, with Isabella's ambition and Catherine's cunning, discretion was no longer armor. It was bait. The battle I had tried to avoid was coming. And the enemy was not across a boardroom table or a bank ledger, it was sitting at my family's own dinner table. The Fairmont Hotel had always been a monument to polished civility, marble floors reflecting chandeliers, velvet chairs that swallowed their occupants whole, waiters gliding noiselessly with silver trays. But when I stepped into the private dining room Isabella had reserved, it felt less like a family lunch and more like a tribunal. She was already seated at the head of the table, her mother, Lady Catherine, beside her. Both women were dressed as if they had come straight from the cover of a society magazine, tailored suits, pearls, posture carved from granite. Isabella smiled as though nothing had ever passed between us. Alexander, she said brightly, rising to kiss the air near my cheek. Thank you for coming. We thought it would be nice to talk, now that we're truly family. Theodore sat across from her, shoulders tense. His eyes met mine briefly, silently pleading, be careful. I nodded and took my seat. Very well. Let's talk. Lady Catherine gestured gracefully to the waiter. We've ordered a bottle of the 98 Bordeaux, she said. A celebration. I allowed myself the smallest smile. Quite a choice. That bottle could pay a month's rent for 3 families in my neighborhood. The smile froze on her lips, but Isabella pressed forward. We've been thinking about the future, she began, her green eyes sharp despite the warmth of her tone. Our families are joined now, and with that comes responsibility. Financial responsibility. There it was, the word they had been circling like hawks. What sort of responsibility? I asked. She opened a leather folder with dramatic precision. Inside were neatly printed documents, highlighted sections, and an organizational chart with my name at the top. I've been studying wealth structures, she said. Foundations. Family boards. Strategic management across generations. I believe it would benefit us all if we established a family foundation. Theodore shifted uncomfortably. Isabella. But she raised a manicured hand. Hear me out, darling. This foundation would allow us to pool resources, gain tax advantages, and create a board of trustees, myself, you, and Alexander, so we can make decisions collectively. It's the modern way wealthy families secure their legacy. Her words flowed with rehearsed ease, but I heard the hunger beneath them. She wasn't asking to share, she was demanding control. And what would you propose for the initial funding? I asked calmly. Her smile sharpened. Something substantial. Perhaps 50 million to establish credibility in philanthropic circles. Theodore nearly choked on his wine. 50. Darling, Isabella said smoothly, placing her hand over his, it's a small amount compared to the scale of opportunity. Imagine the prestige, the influence. Imagine what our children would inherit. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. So you want me to provide $50 million to seed a foundation where decisions are made by committee? By family, Lady Catherine corrected, her voice silky but firm. 3 trustees, equal votes, Isabella added eagerly. Democratic. Transparent. Fair. I let silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I spoke quietly, each word sharp as glass. Tell me, Isabella, you love my son? The question hit her like a slap. Her lips parted, eyes flicking to Theodore, then back to me. What kind of question is that? A simple one, I replied. Do you love Theodore for who he is, or for what you believe being married to him will give you? Theodore froze, his gaze locked on his wife. Catherine bristled, ready to interject, but I raised a hand. Let her answer. Isabella's composure wavered for the first time. Her smile faltered, her eyes hardened. That's an unfair frame, she said, voice tight. Is it? I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a slim folder of my own. I slid it across the table toward her. This is a record of your recent activities. Payments to a private investigations firm. Consultations with Vance and Associates, a law firm specializing in estate disputes. 3 new lines of credit you opened last month, credit secured on the assumption of future financial gain. Theodore's jaw dropped. Isabella, you hired investigators? She stammered, color rising in her cheeks. It's not what it looks like. I was just trying to understand the family's situation. You were building a case, I interrupted. My voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Against me. Against your husband's family. All under the pretense of responsibility. Lady Catherine straightened, her pearls catching the light. Surely you can't blame a young woman for wanting security. Security, I repeated softly. I withdrew another document, this one a financial analysis Sebastian had prepared. I spread it across the table, revealing charts, debts, mortgage records. Your family estate is mortgaged to 80% of its value. Your investment accounts are nearly depleted. Most of your current lifestyle is sustained by consulting fees from Harrington Industries, contracts arranged by me through the new management I put in place. Catherine's face drained of color. Isabella stared, her mask cracking. Theodore turned to his wife, shock written in every line of his face. Is this true? He demanded. Isabella opened her mouth, but no words came. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. You see, I don't mind discretion. I don't mind being underestimated. But I do mind betrayal. You married my son, Isabella, and instead of building a life with him, you tried to build a trap for me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The waiter entered briefly to refill glasses, but even he seemed to sense the chill in the room. When he left, the door clicked shut like the ceiling of a vault. Theodore looked at me, his voice hoarse. Father, what happens now? I held his gaze, then turned back to Isabella. What happens now, I said evenly, is that we stop pretending. If you want to fight, fight openly. But know this, I don't lose. Isabella's green eyes burned with fury and something darker, fear. Lady Catherine said nothing, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. For the first time that night, I allowed myself a smile. The board was set. The pieces were moving. And the Harringtons had no idea the game they thought they'd begun was one I'd been winning for 15 years. The following Monday, I found myself seated at the head of a long mahogany table in Sebastian Caldwell's boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city sprawled below us, indifferent to the battle about to unfold 20 floors above. This was no casual lunch anymore. It was war-dressed in tailored suits and legal briefs. To my right sat Sebastian, calm and precise, his pen resting diagonally across a leather notepad. Across from me, Isabella and Lady Catherine flanked their attorney, a slick man named Mark Vance, who looked as if he billed by the minute just to breathe. At the far end of the table, Charles Harrington tried to appear dignified, though his eyes betrayed nerves. Beside me, Theodore kept his shoulders stiff, the hurt from recent revelations still fresh. Mark cleared his throat first. Let's be clear why we're here. My client, Mrs. Isabella Harrington Whitmore, has concerns about her husband's family assets. Concerns about secrecy. About fairness. His words were measured, but the smugness in his tone revealed the strategy: paint me as manipulative, then demand a share. Sebastian leaned forward. Mr. Vance, my client has nothing to hide that requires explanation to your side of the family. His financial dealings are legal, discreet, and entirely his own. Isabella interjected, her voice tight with indignation. This isn't about legality. It's about trust. Families should share responsibility. We should have transparency. I folded my hands on the table. Transparency, or access? Her lips parted, but I pressed on. At my son's wedding, you called me a filthy old man. A family embarrassment. Then, when your father recognized who I was, you suddenly became fascinated with transparency. Tell me, Isabella, do you want honesty or control? The silence was razor-thin. Even Mark seemed momentarily unsure. Lady Catherine recovered first. What my daughter means, Mr. Whitmore, is that great wealth should not be hidden. It should be organized for the benefit of future generations. Surely you don't want to leave Theodore burdened with confusion. Theodore's face reddened, torn between loyalty and outrage. He looked at me helplessly. I straightened. You want an arrangement? Very well. Here is my proposal. Every head lifted. You have 72 hours, I said, my voice steady, to withdraw all complaints, cease your investigations, and abandon any claim to my assets. In return, I will grant you a settlement that ensures your lifestyle remains intact. Isabella leaned forward eagerly. What kind of settlement? $5 million, I replied. A one-time payment. In exchange, you will sign binding documents agreeing never to contact me or my son again. The room erupted. Mark sputtered. Catherine gasped as though I had slapped her. Charles stared at the table, ashamed but not surprised. Isabella's eyes narrowed. $5 million to disappear. That's correct, I said. Take it, and you walk away with more than you would ever win in court. Refuse, and you'll face litigation, exposure of your family's debts, and the collapse of the facade you cling to. Mark attempted bravado. This sounds less like negotiation and more like coercion. Sebastian countered smoothly. It sounds like a generous offer to end hostilities quickly. Litigation would drag for years, costing far more. Theodore stood abruptly. Stop. All of you. This is insane. You're talking about my marriage as if it were a business deal. I turned to him, my tone softer. And isn't that what it has been, Theodore? A contract built on assumptions of wealth. If Isabella married you for love, then this settlement should mean nothing. But if she married you for money, well, $5 million is a fine test, isn't it? His face twisted with pain as he looked at his wife. Isabella, tell me the truth. Did you marry me because you loved me? Or because you thought my family was rich? The question hung in the air, heavier than any number. Isabella faltered. For the first time, her poise slipped. She glanced at her lawyer, then at her mother, then at her father, who refused to meet her eyes. At last, she said quietly, "That's not a fair question." "It's the only question that matters," I answered. Theodore's expression crumbled, the truth dawning without words. He sat down slowly, covering his face with his hands. I pressed forward. "The offer stands until noon in 3 days. After that, you'll get nothing. Your estate will collapse under its own debt. Your father will lose his consulting income, which, let's be honest, exists only because of me. And you, Isabella, will discover how long high society tolerates those who cannot pay their bills." Mark whispered furiously into Isabella's ear. Catherine hissed objections. But I could see calculation in Isabella's eyes, the cold arithmetic of survival. Finally, she said, "I need time to think." 72 hours, I repeated. Not a second longer. I rose, and Sebastian followed. Theodore remained frozen in his chair, torn in two, while the Harringtons huddled like gamblers staring at dwindling chips. As I left the boardroom, I felt no triumph. Only clarity. For years, I had lived invisible, hiding my fortune for Theodore's sake. But invisibility was no longer a shield. It was a stage. And now, the curtain had lifted. The game would end one way or another. But this time, the rules were mine. The 72 hours I had given the Harringtons passed like the ticking of a pendulum in a silent cathedral. Every hour was heavy, every minute deliberate. I knew Isabella well enough by then to expect resistance. But desperation has a way of bending even the proudest necks. At precisely 11:47 on the third morning, Sebastian Caldwell received a call from Mark Vance. The attorney's voice, usually lacquered with smug confidence, was uncharacteristically subdued. "Mrs. Whitmore will accept the offer," he said. $5 million, in exchange for complete separation. The documents are ready for signatures. By 5 o'clock that evening, the papers were signed, the money wired, and Isabella Harrington Whitmore, the bride who had humiliated me at her own wedding, vanished from our lives like a ghost. No more calls. No more prying eyes. No more threats of exposure. Just silence, expensive and absolute. Theodore filed for divorce the following week. The words, irreconcilable differences, looked cold on paper, but I knew the truth beneath them. He had looked into his wife's eyes, searched for love, and found only calculation. That was a wound deeper than any insult flung my way. I will never forget the night he came to my apartment, his suit wrinkled, his hair unkempt, a man who had aged years in a matter of weeks. He collapsed into the chair across from me, staring at the floor. "Father," he said, "I don't even know who I married." I poured him a drink, something strong enough to numb but not erase. "You know now," I said gently. "And that is a painful kind of freedom." He looked at me then, eyes red. "Did you plan this? Did you orchestrate it just to prove you were right?" The question stung, but I answered truthfully. "No, Theodore. I never wanted your marriage to fail. I only wanted you to see her clearly before she destroyed you." Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 15 years of secrets. Finally, he asked the question I had dreaded most, "Who are you really, Father?" And so I told him. About Eleanor. About the patent. About the first 30 million that became hundreds of millions. About the investments, the shell companies, the quiet acquisition of Harrington Industries. About every decision made in the shadows to shield him from the curse of inherited wealth. When I finished, he sat back, stunned. "All this time I thought you were living off savings." "I was living off discretion," I corrected. "And I would do it all again. Because the man you've become is yours, not mine." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, "I don't know if I should thank you or hate you." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Both are allowed." 6 months later, Theodore called me on a Sunday afternoon. His voice was lighter than it had been in years. "Father," he said, "I've met someone. Her name is Sarah. She teaches at the local elementary school. She doesn't know you're rich, and when I told her my father lived in a modest apartment and drove an old sedan, she said it sounded like you had your priorities straight." I smiled, feeling something inside me loosen at last. "She sounds perfect. When do I get to meet her?" "Next Sunday." "But Father, when you meet her, could you just be the man who raised me? Leave the tycoon at home." I laughed. "Of course. But if she starts investigating our finances, the deal's off." He chuckled, and in that moment, I heard my son again, not the wounded groom, not the man broken by betrayal, but Theodore, my boy, whole once more. After everything, I made a choice. The apartment where I had hidden for 15 years felt haunted by shadows, by Eleanor's absence, by the lies I had told, by the battles fought in silence. So I sold it. I moved to Santa Fe, a city Eleanor had always dreamed of visiting. There, I became just another man in the marketplace, wandering among pottery stalls, talking with artists, breathing the clean desert air. Nobody knew me as the hidden millionaire or the humiliated father-in-law. They knew me as Alexander, the widower who liked blue shawls and strong coffee. But I did not abandon my wealth. Instead, I redirected it. I created the Eleanor Fund, named for the woman whose belief had started it all. The fund supports young engineers from modest families, students with bright ideas but no resources. I wanted them to have the chance Eleanor had given me to turn sketches into patents, dreams into devices. Watching those students present their prototypes at international fairs brought me more satisfaction than any dividend ever had. One young man from Detroit approached me in tears after winning a grant. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "thank you. Without you, I'd still be stacking boxes in a warehouse. Now I'm studying engineering in Pittsburgh." His gratitude was the true return on investment. And so, I discovered the paradox of power: the less you wield it to impress, the stronger it becomes. I had lived invisible for 15 years, mistaking silence for safety. But invisibility was never the goal. Authenticity was. I learned that revenge need not be loud. It need not destroy. Sometimes the most elegant revenge is to thrive where others wished you diminished. Isabella thought she had married into poverty and mocked me for it. She left with $5 million wealth, enough to start over, but also a number that forever marked the price of her betrayal. Meanwhile, I remained, not ruined but renewed. My son healed. My wife's legacy lived on. My own peace, hard-won, was finally mine to enjoy. On Christmas that year, I sat with Theodore and Sarah in my modest Santa Fe home. We sang carols off-key, burned cookies in the oven, and laughed until midnight. No chandeliers, no pearls, no Harrington banners looming above us. Just warmth, honesty, and the sound of family. As I stared at the glowing tree, I thought of Eleanor. I could almost hear her voice: "You've protected him long enough. Now let him live." Yes, the world knew my fortune now, or at least the ones who mattered did. But it no longer frightened me. Because money, I realized, is not the measure of a man. The measure is how he chooses to spend his days. And I, Alexander Whitmore, chose peace. If anyone ever dares call me a filthy old man again, I will simply smile. Because I know the truth: the real shame is not in growing old, but in wasting a life chasing appearances when you could be leaving behind something that endures.